So this is a project I'm working on at the state level here in Massachusetts. And really, fundamentally, I don't always talk about it this way, but fundamentally at the heart of Incorruptible Mass is the idea of revitalizing our democracy. So, you know, a lot of people talk about the fact that our democracy really is in crisis. You know, more than 40% of people in the U.S. don't believe that that Biden legitimately won the election. That's kind of terrifying. Lawmakers in 47 states have introduced bills that would make it harder to vote. I think in 18 or 19 of those bills have passed. This 538 article, How Hatred Came to Dominate American Politics, is really about negative partisanship. I don't know if people have heard of negative partisanship. It's a weird term, but it means that it's not just that Democrats don't like what the Republican elected officials are doing and that Republican voters don't like what Democratic elected officials are doing. It's when Democratic voters think that the biggest problem in America is Republican voters, that Republican voters are bad people, and that Republican voters think the same thing about Democratic voters, that the biggest problem in America is Democratic voters, that they are bad. And they do, I think in this article, they talk about it historically as a prelude to democratic collapse, that when, you know, people sort of, not the elite, but the people at you know, in the parties who just are regular voters on the street think that the other side are genuinely bad people. And this last one, the scary statistic that predicts growing U.S. political violence, what a clickbaity title, right? Makes you want to click on it. And this is one where a couple of scientists put together a statistic that, you know, mainly includes inequality. And I did study inequality primarily when I was doing urban planning graduate school. One thing researchers in the field of inequality understand is when inequality gets really high, you get political unrest, whether you like it or not. And that political unrest can take the form of all sorts of things. It can be in the form of, you know, protests and rioting. It can be in the form of sort of anti-government things like the Gretchen Whitmer attempted kidnapping or the January 6th events. And so I want to talk a little bit about inequality. And by the way, the opening of this whole thing, I'm going to give a bunch of statistics. I'm going to talk about research and a little bit more sort of theory behind what is happening in America. And the whole second half is going to be optimistic, and it's going to be talking about a solution. So don't be too worried. It's all going to turn out, I mean, we hope that it's all going to turn out fine. There are things that we can do and actions we can take. So don't get too depressed in this beginning part. But I want to talk about inequality because it is a really important statistic when you're talking about democracy. Countries with incredibly high inequality end up with a very hard time having a true democracy, truly democratic elections. So if you look at this is just looking at the top share of what the 1% own compared to everyone else from 1913, and it goes till about 2012. And you can see that the highest point in there was like 1928, 1929, and that was right before, of course, the stock market crash and the Great Depression. And then there were a ton of policies that happened in the 30s and 40s that allowed us, and this is just in America, allowed us to have stable, relatively low inequality, right? You can see still the top 1% have 10% of all resources. So we're not talking about people being completely equal. We just mean that it's not like wildly, crazily high. And then in the 80s, it starts to climb. And what this chart doesn't show, and I can't find any charts that show this because I think it would be terrifying, is that by about 2018, 2019, we have already exceeded that level in 1928, 29. And then COVID hit. And any guesses what happened during COVID? Did inequality get larger or smaller? Larger. So during COVID, worldwide, this is just one statistic, that billionaires gained about almost $4 trillion, and workers lost at least $3.5 trillion. So inequality during COVID skyrocketed above its historic levels. So this is not good. We don't want this. And the way that we see the crisis in democracy is really that it is a crisis of power. And essentially, when the American people should be able to make their government do what we want it to do. That's what democracy is supposed to be. But right now, and for the last few decades, even when the American people mostly agree, like on climate change or on background checks on guns, which has like in the 90s support, even when we mostly agree, we cannot get those policies passed through Congress. But there are people who do get their policies passed, and they are, the fossil fuel industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the health insurance industry, Wall Street. They can make the government do what they want it to do. So I want to talk a little bit about the Princeton study. Have people heard of the Princeton study? A little bit. Yeah, I love this one. It's a little bit old. I think it was 20 years. They took 20 years of bills that went through Congress, ones that passed, ones that failed. And it was about 2,000 bills. And it went up till maybe 2005. So it's a little bit outdated, but I think still quite relevant. And they looked at how likely the bill was to pass and what kind of support it had. And so the first thing they looked at was, if you look at this, ideally, a bill on the far left, if it has no support among the American people, it wouldn't pass, right? It would be at 0. And if a bill had 100% support among the American people, it would pass. That's what you want to see. That would mean we had a democracy. But what they found was that among the bottom 90% of wage earners or wealth owners in America, this purple line was reflective of the actuality of the likelihood of bills in Congress to pass. So that means a bill that was absolutely hated, nobody wanted to pass, among the bottom 90% of people, had a 30% chance of passing. And bills that were wildly popular, that everyone in America among the bottom 90% wanted to pass, had a 30% chance of passing. But if you look at the top 10%, you see that, and they call this elite representation, you see that the bills that were genuinely hated by the top 10% could be completely vetoed. And it didn't matter if the bottom 90% of Americans all wanted those bills. Complete veto power. None of those bills could pass. And over 60% of the bills that the top 10% wanted would pass. So it's a relatively close line. I actually wish that they had done another statistic, which was looking at the top 1%. Because I imagine that probably it would have been closer to the ideal, that ideal representation line. We don't know because they didn't do it, but it's something to think about. And so the people who did this study, their quote from their study is that the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on policy. So when we think about the crisis in American democracy, the way that I think about it is that over the last 40 years or so, we have lost our ability to make the government do what we want. And it's taken this long for it really to get into people's minds that this is the reality that we have. It's taken a while. It's taken until the point where inequality is so high that 50% of Americans don't have $500 in the bank. Right? 50% of Americans are living such precarious lives, and this was before COVID. So I don't know what the statistic is now, but such precarious lives that they've begun to question, why is my life like this? And that people no longer believe that they're properly represented. Right? That, to me, is the crisis that we have in American democracy. And to me, there's all sorts of ways to explain this. You could say, we have a crisis in confidence in our institutions. You could say that it's due to polarization. You could say it's due to racism. You could say it's due to, the crumbling of, the end of sort of manufacturing in America and the crumbling of those towns. You could say there's a million things that you could blame this on. But really, it is a question of power. The American people do not have the power to make our government do what we want it to do. And there are a powerful few who do have that power. Right? It's about power. We could just boil it down to that one thing. We don't have to worry about all those 20 other things that we're talking about in terms of taking action. Right? So really what we need to do is flip the balance of power. And I have just been incredibly fortunate that for the last 5 years or so, I have traveled around the country, really guiding people in how to use a particular strategy of political organizing that I learned on the West Coast. And so here we're going to end the rather terrifying, depressing statistics about where we are right now. And we're going to look at some examples of where democracy has been revitalized and how they did it and how we also can make that happen. So I learned this from some folks in a little town about a stone's throw from San Francisco. It's called Richmond, California. And this is a city that was basically owned by Chevron. So Chevron, for 100 years, Chevron had poured money into the political process. They had been the largest employer in town. And every 5 years or so, there would be a spill or an explosion, sending hundreds of people to the hospital, doing long-term damage to the environment. And like other corrupt cities, it also had a lot of other problems. So wages were kept very low compared to the surrounding cities. There were terrible police brutality problems in a predominantly African-American and Latino population. They had the second highest homicide rate in the country. So really a troubled city. And Chevron had so much influence over city politics that they had a desk inside City Hall. Chevron and only Chevron has a desk inside City Hall along with all of the city councilors and the mayor. So Chevron really controlled what policies could pass, and people would run for office. They would make all sorts of promises. They would promise to increase wages. They would promise to, do something about, hold Chevron accountable for all of the damage that they had done and get people, paid back for their hospital bills. They would, try to claim they were going to rein in the police, do all these things. And of course, then they would get into office and nothing would happen, right? They would not follow through on those campaign promises. So in 2003, a group was formed by a bunch of residents there called the Richmond Progressive Alliance. And it was a coalition of BIPOC and progressive organizations that got together with the sole exclusive goal of electing a majority of people over profit candidates to the city council, right? Taking back their city. And they began in 2003. They got one city councilor elected, and then the next cycle they got another elected. That first person, who was one of their founders, became the mayor. Then they got a majority elected on the city council. Then they got a super majority elected on the city council. And I want to tell you that this was not without opposition, right? This is a city of 110,000 people. And in 2014 alone, Chevron poured in $3 million into city elections. If you can imagine how far $3 million goes in a city of 110,000 people, that is an insane amount of money. And Chevron is, and by the way, I will say that election cycle, all of the RPA-backed candidates won, and all of the Chevron-backed candidates lost. Okay? And Chevron is not the only industry to pour millions of dollars into city elections. Big Soda, they were doing a soda tax, and Big Soda began pouring in millions of dollars. They were pushing for, they actually passed this incredible bill that allowed the city to use their power of eminent domain to force Wall Street banks to sell back the mortgages of underwater Richmond mortgages to the city at current market value, so that the city could then renegotiate the mortgage with the resident. And because of that policy, Wall Street poured millions of dollars into the elections. And yet, the RPA, Richmond Progressive Alliance, has won a majority on the city council cycle after cycle after cycle. So their electoral prowess is truly incredible. And like nothing, honestly, like nothing I have ever seen before. Is amazing, right? But I want to talk about something that I think is even more amazing, which is that after their elected officials were elected, they stayed completely true to their policies that they originally ran on, right? They have, and the RPA, the way the RPA works is they have a policy platform. So it's not that they just endorse people who each have different policy platforms. The RPA has a policy platform. And so these candidates, after they were elected, they did not go back on their campaign promises, right? They reduced the homicide rate in Richmond by 75%. They got over $100 million from Chevron in new taxes coming into the city. They passed the first rent control bill in the state of California in 30 years. They completely turned around their police force, who by, I think, 2014 or so, was considered one of the best community policing forces in the country. And of course, the policy of being able to renegotiate the underwater mortgages after 2008. These policies, this is what I call flipping the balance of power, right? You don't actually know whether power has flipped until you pass policies that affect people's lives. And that is what the Richmond Progressive Alliance has done. And so I've worked with the mayor from Richmond, Gail McLaughlin, and with other folks from the Richmond Progressive Alliance to put together a series of workshops. And I've traveled all over the country really guiding people using these workshops in how to flip the balance of power in your city, from your city council or from your school board. I've done a couple at the state level as well. And what I want to talk about next, so I'm absolutely dedicated to this strategy. I'm like a dog with a bone, right? People have offered me more money to do other things, and I just can't do it because I know what it looks like for democracy to be revitalized. I have seen it happen. And so to me, this is the most important thing I can personally do with my life. So this is what I choose to do. And Incorruptible Mass is working to flip the balance of power at the Massachusetts State House. And I want to talk a little bit about why we should worry, or why we should focus our energy on a state like Massachusetts. Because often I will hear from people, both in Massachusetts and in other states, that, you know, Massachusetts is doing okay, right? We should go somewhere that's, you know, in a worse position. We should be helping people in some other state. So I want to make a strong argument for why we need to be working in blue states, and it's because this is a national strategy. It's a national strategy that starts with the states, and it is a strategy to revitalize democracy. Republicans know how to enact their horrible regressive policies nationally. What they do is they go to deep red states, they take over the state legislatures, and they begin passing laws. They ban abortion, they take away people's voting rights. There's a ton of different things that they're doing. And they get those laws enacted, they put them in place, and then they cookie cutter them to other states. And you know how their base feels about it. Their base might only be like people who really are absolutely anti-choice and who, you know, the things that the Republicans are doing, that base might only be 20-25%. But those people, do you know how totally engaged they are? Because their policies are getting passed. They're excited, they're motivated, they see the momentum that they're having, and guess what? Roe v. Wade is on the chopping block right now. This is a successful strategy. And they're doing it in red states, right? They're not coming to the bluest of blue states and trying to stop us from passing our policies. Not that they don't, you know, I mean, maybe, I don't know, but I don't really see them doing a lot of work. Like the Republican Party is not like focusing their energy in Massachusetts. We need to focus on blue states where our policies have absolutely got majority support among the people, we need to elect enough people in those state legislatures to pass laws that are going to absolutely change people's lives. And that's going to totally reinvigorate people and excite our base and get our base really excited to come out and vote. And once we pass laws in Massachusetts, it becomes much easier to pass those laws in other states. If you think about what impact it would have to have truly universal health care, free at the point of service, in any one state in the country, it would be the end of a profit-driven healthcare, health insurance system. That, we're the only ones in the whole world that have this system that allows people to become totally bankrupt simply because they become sick. And you can go down the line in terms of the Green New Deal and rights for immigrants and any of the other policies that we really care about. Passing them in one state is really the way that we have to move forward in terms of passing them in other states. So I'm going to talk just a little bit. I've kind of covered this a bit, but I want you to imagine, I don't know how many people here are into football. I'm not really into football, but into football? Not so this is probably the wrong analogy. Oh, good, we've got some here. Excellent. So my analogy. Hey, all right. Finding things out about each other. So if you think about it, imagine that people who don't vote in America are people who don't go to football games, right? And we all vote. We go to that football game. We're excited about it. We have our team. Our team's the blue team, right? The other team's the red team. So we're going to invite our friends who are not into football, not into voting. We're going to invite them to come to a match. Come on, it's going to be so exciting. You're going to love it. Our team's going to win. It's going to be great. And they come to this football game. And what they see is the red team is driving down the field, and they get to our 10-yard line. And then suddenly our blue team is like, oh my gosh, we got to defend our goal. Let's all run over and make sure that, let's start. They finally begin taking action. They begin fighting back. They begin playing for real, right, to prevent the red team from scoring a goal. Then that's exciting the first time, right? And it's maybe exciting the second time. But by the 10th time that the blue team just never gets past the 50-yard line, the blue team is not driving the ball forward. The blue team is not scoring goals. The blue team is not passing policy that changes people's lives. And I have to bring this back. I know that Democrats have passed policies, but over the course of many, many years, inequality has continued to increase and increase and increase. And the only time it decreases is because of a stock market crash or a housing crash. This is not decreasing because of policy that we're passing. So in order to invigorate people, and this is the way I think about, one of the ways to think about reinvigorating democracy is about when people are at that ball game, is our team exciting them by scoring goals? We've got to score some goals. And we don't score goals by waiting until the red team is on our 10-yard line, right? By waiting until the red team is passing horrible regressive policies in Texas and Florida and Oklahoma, and then running over there and desperately trying to stop them. We reinvigorate our base by fighting our fight on their 10-yard line. We have to fight them in places where we are strong and they are weak. And those are in blue states. So this is why I am dedicated to making Massachusetts a leader in progressive policy and passing those policies here in Massachusetts that we can then take from one state to another, getting our policies passed nationally. Massachusetts is a great place to start, right? We have overwhelmingly Democratic voting base, and you can see that we have veto-proof supermajorities of Democrats in both houses. The state Senate is like over 90%, right? There's like 3 or 4 Republicans in the entire state Senate, and the Massachusetts State House also veto-proof supermajority. So this is a place where we really can enact this national strategy. Why are we unable to pass? These are from some flyers that we hand out. I should have brought a few, but We hand these out at our events, and so each one of these is a policy that really the people of Massachusetts, the majority of the people of Massachusetts want to pass, and yet this is how many years each of these policies has been sitting at the State House. So things like universal health care, things like not separating immigrant families, which happens right here in Massachusetts. It's things like same-day registration, like voting rights, support for our LGBTQ plus community, free public college. Massachusetts has the fastest growing student debt averages in the entire country. So these are not policies that are crazy policies. These are pretty much policies that are supported by the majority of people in Massachusetts. They're also in the Democratic Party platform officially, and these policies get passed by our state Senate. So what is going on in the Massachusetts State House that we can't pass any of these policies for decades and decades and decades? And people talk about a lot of things, right? I don't know, how many people here have heard like some of the Act on Mass presentations or some of the other presentations about like what's happening in the Massachusetts State House? Oh, okay, great, a couple people, great.
Well, things are not brought up, okay, they get stuck in committees.
Mm-hmm.
We also have Republican governors frequently, which is a problem. But in the State House, yes, things get sent to study and to committees, and they kind of die there over a period of time. That's
Yeah.
one way.
And can we see what happens in committees?
No transparency.
No transparency, yeah. There's a lot of problems at the State House. So people talk about a lot of different problems that are happening at the State House. So transparency is a huge problem. There's no way, by the way, don't know if you know this, you cannot find out how your own state rep is voting on bills or how any state reps are voting on bills. Hard to hold them accountable. By default, their votes are secret. Some of those votes, like 10 or 20 every year do get revealed because they choose to reveal them. But by default, every vote is secret. And it's not uncommon for a bill to be in committee. That committee has 2/3 of the people who are sitting on the committee are co-sponsors, official co-sponsors of the bill, and bill does not move forward out of committee. How does that happen? Nobody knows, because we can't find out. We're also only one of 2 states in the whole country where all 3 branches of our state government are exempt from public records law. So we cannot use a FOIA request. We can't even do a Freedom of Information Act request to find out what is going on there. It is totally secret. Everything done in backroom deals. We are one of the worst states in terms of transparency and open government. But there are a lot of other problems, right? So there are financial incentives that are a huge problem. The culture at the State House is very retaliatory and a lot of bullying, and it's very bad. And there are tons of problems there. But again, it's hard to attack a bunch of different problems at the same time. And really, it boils down to one very simple thing. You can probably guess what I'm going to say. What is it about? Power. I'm going to show you a video. This is what I mean when I say it's about power. Okay? Most of the time, you cannot, we don't know how people are voting. So this is an unusual vote. This is one of the times when they agreed beforehand. They were like, oh, we're going to go ahead and let this vote be public. And here you can watch the voting happen. So the presiding state rep says, we are going to have 3 minutes to vote, and the speaker and I vote no. So you can see that a lot of no votes are coming in. It's kind of hard to see, but Eligardo is a green, right? And there's one other green that's going to come up here on the right. Everybody else is voting no. And then we hear, oh, wait, I'm sorry. That should have been a yes. So the speaker is like, we were supposed to vote yes. And he's like, oh, sorry. Okay, change our votes to yes. So they changed their 2 votes to yes. And now, watch what's happening. We can see a bunch of yes votes coming in. This is the second half of people, right? Now, there were 66 no votes on the board, 66. And they hadn't even finished voting yet. And I want you to watch how many the final tally is. 0 no votes. There were 66 no votes on the board. And what is most remarkable about this happened in 2019. Mostly we don't even see this happening. This is one of the rare instances where we get a window into what happens at the State House. There were 66 no votes on the board. By the time if they had taken 3 minutes and let them finish, maybe there would have been 120, we don't know. And no arm twisting, no backroom deals, right? Nothing happened except that they saw that the speaker changed his vote, and 65 other people just changed their votes to whatever the speaker voted. Because they understand that if they don't, then they might get their cushy chairmanship of a committee taken away, which includes their salary being taken away. They might have their parking spot taken away. They might have their ability to use the conference rooms taken away. They might have, like all of these things then come up. Like transparency obviously hides all of this. The incentives that the speaker has and the financial incentives and other incentives, that falls into this. But all of those details, like really we just need to say, the speaker has the power to ensure the passage or failure of any policy position he wants. That's it. And he's not by himself, right? He has donors, he has a leadership team. So it's not like it's only that one person. And I want people to understand that this is the last 4 speakers of the House. 3 of them were convicted of felonies related to corruption and bribery, and the 4th was an unindicted co-conspirator. So this is not a problem where we just have to replace that one person. This is a systemic problem. But, before I go to that, I'm going to go to that in just a second. Yeah, I like to hear the laughter. So why this? I've watched people use the strategy and I'll call it the Incorruptible strategy, right? Because we've been training people in it over the last 5 years through an organization called the Incorruptibles, right? And actually, before I go on, let me say one thing about the name, Incorruptible, right? The Incorruptibles, which is the national organization, or Incorruptible Mass, because sometimes people are like, I don't know, do you really think, can I trust your organization if you think that some people are incorruptible? But the entire point of the name is to make you question. So we hope that by using the word incorruptible, we're making you think, what do you mean by, what does that mean? What does it mean to be incorruptible? Can anybody really be incorruptible? Is that something that you can be? Can't anyone be corrupted? And this is an absolute formative, foundational principle of ours, is that no one is incorruptible. No one. Not you, not me, not any of our elected officials, not even the ones that we absolutely love. No one is incorruptible. And we see being incorruptible the way that we see being in shape. You're not in shape because you're born that way. I'm not talking about being skinny or, I'm not talking about the way you look. I'm talking about being strong. You're only in shape because you do the daily, weekly, monthly habits that keep you that way. And that's how we see being incorruptible as well. That you have to constantly be working at incorruptibility, right? To be constantly working at it. You have to have the right environment for it. So I want to talk a little bit about, let me look at the clock, because I think we're doing okay. I've thought a lot about the strategy that I train people in. And it can seem complicated sometimes. So I'll tell you a little bit about what we do. We put together a broad coalition, like I said, of BIPOC and progressive organizations, and then we run a slate of candidates, like a group of candidates all running together on a single, like a solidarity platform of policy issues. Then we elect as many as we can, and importantly, and this is something that's a little unique, and I'll talk more about it later, we support those elected officials after the election. Really crucial to support them after the election, and there's a lot of moving parts to the support as well, and it can seem like there's so many things, it's complex, right? There's so many things to remember to do and all of that. So what makes this strategy great is that at its foundation, there's a thing that we understand, that we've kind of come to see as a recurring problem in progressive electoral politics, that it just happens to us over and over and over and over. We don't do anything about it, and it causes us to be unable to gain power. And And the strategy is designed to make sure that doesn't happen. So every piece of the strategy, the reason we do it the way we do, is to make sure that we don't have that recurring problem. And I'm going to show you the recurring problem, which we call cinema syndrome. So how many people know what Kirsten Sinema, either what she's like now or how she started? Great. You want to say a little bit about one of those?
She was frustrated as a Green Party activist who was always on the losing side, so she decided to be on the winning side and became committed to that at the expense of everything else.
Okay. Yeah. I would say that, just to be clear, that as a Green Party candidate, because, you know, just to make sure everyone understands, you don't accidentally end up a Green Party candidate, okay? Right? To be a Green Party candidate, she was anti-capitalism, she was anti-war, she was, for every proposal in Warren or Bernie's platform, she was for every left proposal there is. Just think of a left policy proposal, she was for it. And now, she is almost single-handedly blocking everything she once stood for. She was one of the ones blocking Build Back Better, including all the policies that were in that, universal pre-K, and you know, you could go on and on. Gave the famous thumbs down to the $15 minimum wage. She's blocking voting rights. I mean, she is essentially a Republican. So, and this is not uncommon. I mean, think about how many people that you've been excited about who kind of let you down after they've gotten elected.
Where's her money coming from?
Sure. Well, of course, she takes all sorts of terrible, terrible money. And that is part of the problem. But one thing that I didn't really put in this, but I have a whole chapter. By the way, I wrote a book. I'm writing a book on this. It's called Incorruptible, Fixing the Crisis in American Democracy, and you can download the first chapter of it on the Incorruptible Mass website, so I'll put that up on the screen at the end. I have a whole chapter on corruption, and I will just, to give you something to think about, I will say a lot of times people think that corruption is about money, and it's not that it's not about money, but it happens way earlier than money. Like, people don't wake up one day and say, I think that I will take $100,000 from the fossil fuel industry and vote to destroy the planet today. That's not how it happens. By the time they take the money, they've already taken thousands of other steps, each one a small step away from the one before, so that when they take that money, it seems like it's hardly any different from what they did yesterday. So I have a whole chapter on corruption which, you know, gets into that. But for now, I will just say that we see this as the cardinal rule of politics, which is that every elected official moves only in one direction. They move away from the needs of the vast majority of Americans and toward the demands of the powerful few. Now, it doesn't mean that every elected official is moving quickly down there, right? Obviously, Kirsten Sinema is a good example because she moved incredibly fast and all the way from the left all the way to the right. But people just don't move back the other way. How can we make them move back the other way? We have to be the powerful. And then all those people who are like, Kirsten Sinema is just more malleable. So she succumbed to this cardinal rule more quickly than other people. But if we can gain power, then a lot of those people will come back to us. So Incorruptible Mass, here's just now what we're doing specifically at the state level. Incorruptible Mass, we're going to flip the balance of power. We're going to elect more progressives than other strategies you've seen. We are going to keep them incorruptible, and we have ways of passing policy before we get to a majority. And here's where I'm going to skim through what we do. There's a lot more details, but just to give you an idea, a little taste, our coalition of BIPOC and progressive organizations works closely with the candidates and elected officials and with marginalized constituencies so that we're all amplifying each other's efforts and that everything we do is tied in to an electoral campaign and to sort of an electoral lens. And very specifically, I have to talk about the support we provide. Because at this point, after 5 years of doing this, I've noticed that that people have begun to see that slates, like a slate of candidates, can be a powerful way to win. So I've seen that happening in a few different places. People putting together a coalition is really strong. So some of these elements, I think, have begun to come into people's consciousness. The part that I haven't seen anyone else do, except for the group I learned it from and the groups that I have guided, is the support after the election. And the way the RPA says it is they say, if you don't support your elected officials after they get elected, you have to expect them to move to the other side. You have to expect it. And it's very typical for progressive organizations to work really hard to get people elected. And I hear this from elected officials, elected mayors, elected city councilors. They get elected, like more and more people join their campaigns, they have more and more volunteers, they're surrounded by people who are supporting them, it's incredible. And then they have the election night party and everyone is there, and then everyone goes home, and no one ever comes back, and they are left alone. The other side, the people who are funded by huge corporate dollars, they are never alone. They have think tanks and donors. Their volunteers might go home, but the think tanks and the donors, they are working tirelessly to help them, to write legislation, to help them understand legislation, to tell them what talking points they should use in order to explain their votes on legislation. They have tons of support, but our people are the only ones who are left totally on their own. And it's very, very difficult. So when people enter the State House in Massachusetts specifically, and this is also because we're a one-party state, the Speaker of the House is the only person who has rewards and punishments. We call them carrots and sticks to offer. He has a ton of carrots and sticks. As long as you do what he asks, you get carrots. When you don't do what he asks, you get sticks. No one else is offering anything at all. And so, no surprise, people move pretty quickly over toward what the Speaker wants to do. So what we offer is a whole coalition of policy experts that are working in concert with each other. We have a group of pro bono lawyers from ACLU, National Lawyers Guild, retired lawyers, student lawyers, able to help with interpreting policy, with ensuring that your new policy is not going to run into, problems, just small technical problems, which happens a lot for new legislators. We have volunteers who are trained in constituent services. Anytime something big happens like COVID or anything else, a lot of times they're just completely overwhelmed by constituents who need help with, getting through the unemployment, things or whatever it might be. So we help lift those burdens. And what it does is it allows our elected officials to do something that elected officials are uniquely positioned to do, which is to engage marginalized voices directly in the political process. And we also facilitate them doing this as well. Just a little bit about the team. So Incorruptible Mass was started a year and a half ago. I ran for state rep, and we call it the three moms who ran for state rep. So me and Damali Vidot, who's an amazing city councilor in Chelsea, Mariana Rivera, who took my training in 2018, used it to win a slate of candidates for the school board in Lawrence, became a school board member herself, and then she ran for state rep. And the three of us, after we did not win in 2020, we were locked out of, because of COVID, none of us could knock on doors. So, it was a very difficult election cycle. But we started really dreaming about a big slate of progressive candidates running for the State House in 2022. And we're joined by Jordan Burke-Powers, who runs Mass Alliance, and Jonathan Cohn, who's on the board of Progressive Mass. These are just some testimonials. I'm not going to leave it up long enough for you to read them, but just people who have taken our workshops before, saying things like the training the Incorruptible provides is invaluable. That's the mayor of San Luis Obispo, and this approach is like nothing I've seen before in 2 decades of activism. I've told everyone I know that they need this workshop. So people love it. This, again, I feel like we're getting close to time, so I don't want to go too long. I thought I added a bunch of stuff. This was a 12-minute talk, and I was like, I have an hour, so I got to make it a half an hour, and I'm afraid that I have talked for too long. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward. This is the last slide. When I've seen democracy be revitalized, I can kind of paint a picture of what it looks like, right? Non-voters become voters. Voters join issue movements, or they join their community groups for their particular community, and they become activists. activists become the aides to the elected officials, actively working on policy with them. And then those aides end up being the next candidates who become the next elected officials. And the reason it works so well is that then the elected officials are the ones who go around with the people, you know, and I'm organizing some of these here in Medford as well. We're organizing people who are really in marginalized communities to have listening sessions with elected officials directly, so that, you know, elected officials can hear what they need and what they have to say, and we can engage them in the political process, right? Pass some of the policies that they need the most, get them excited, get them to vote, bring them into that triangle so that they can begin moving up. And it's very exciting. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Whew, sorry this took so long. But I would love to take any questions or just chit chat about it or anything else.